So let's get right into BRICS as well, because you mentioned OPEC Plus, and I think that's they almost go hand in hand. But in a lot of ways, we've seen that spiral effect happen, especially over the past couple months, years since the 2022 invasion. And I think for the American people, if they were to immediately be able to point at an economic area where they could see a massive spike, it's in oil prices. A lot of that comes down to the relationship with OPEC Plus, but as well as we have countries within BRICS calling to create their own currency. I know Brazil was quoting that just recently. How do you see a BRICS currency? Is it a threat to the U.S. dollar? How do you see BRICS kind of navigating in the economic environment that's developing over the past year since that invasion?
So, firstly, to talk about the core of BRICS, which is Russia and China there, of course, in February of 2022, just before the invasion, they declared what's called a friendship without limits. I think that the last year and a half have very much proven the case that there are real limits there. And that speaks to a lot of the issues within the BRICS alliance or BRICS partnership, whatever you want to call it. It's not a formal structure more broadly, right? There is still unarmed, but physical clashes occasionally in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian soldiers. These countries all have a lot of geopolitical differences, even if they all, to one extent or another, chafe at the rise of the U.S. But India, in particular, is, of course, more concerned about China and has moved to improve its relations with the United States, and that's something that gains support both from the BJP of the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, as well as the Congress opposition in India. So I think there's a lot of over-assumption about BRICS' strength and unity, right? The three things Putin has wanted from China throughout this war are a new gas pipeline deal to replace some of the European markets, something they've been discussing since before the war, loans to replace the lack of access to Western credit markets, and then finally, also direct Chinese military support, and hasn't received any of that. Russia, even just this weekend, it was reported that Russian banks are being restricted on their ability to send Chinese currency to China and from there on to Western banks, in part because some of those Chinese banks are likely worried about U.S. Sanctions threats. Potentially that's also connected to Blinken's visit over the last few days. That has also, sort of been aimed at trying to lower tensions between the U.S. and China. But back to BRICS itself, fundamentally, I think it's important to understand that BRICS faces a real challenge in that all the countries mentioned in the BRICS acronym, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are countries that run substantial surpluses, right? They export more than they import. So effectively what they have is a glut of savings and a need to invest it in somewhere that they can earn a return in a stable credit market. None of them offer that. China is probably large enough, even though it too runs surpluses, to at least offer it somewhat, but it has capital controls, so you can't move your money freely in and out of China, which of course with countries that have tensions there is going to be a real issue, right? India may occasionally have its disagreements with the U.S., but it always knows that it can move its money in and out, and certainly that is highly unlikely to change unless it takes the kind of action that gets it sanctioned in the way Russia has, which is hard to foresee. So, without sort of access to a deficit market for those investments, it's really hard for a BRICS currency and a BRICS debt market to exist. And this gets to, a really important point, which is that a instrument of debt in a currency and an instrument of that currency are broadly one and the same thing, right? So just to make it easier for listeners, we'll talk about U.S. dollars and treasury bills. A U.S. dollar is a debt, right? It says on the back there, guaranteed by the Federal Reserve and, tradable. Of course, you can no longer get gold for it as, you used to be able to in the early Bretton Woods era, but that instrument is essentially exchangeable for a claim on the U.S. government. And so as governments change their interest rates, the values of those claims go up and down with them. But really, debt and dollars or debt in any currency of that same debt are really interfungible instruments. And by having your currency become accepted and be used as the instrument of account and instrument of trade in both trade and financing transactions, you increase demand for it, and you sort of in an ideal world, then for a BRICS currency, for example, you'd make it so that that currency can effectively operate without U.S. Ability to interfere and to threaten sanctions, right? And I think the best example to do this is to look at the euro, right? In Europe, most European financing and most European trade is now invoiced in euros rather than in dollars. But because the European banking system is so connected to the U.S. banking system, they borrow from one another. You have many dollar transactions and occasionally euro transactions into the U.S. That go back between one and the other, even though the euro is standalone, because the political system that exists in is allied with the U.S. and has deep economic linkages there. Even though the U.S. dollar doesn't display the elements of global reserve currency or trade currency that make it so powerful elsewhere, that makes it not really a threat to the dollar system. For the BRICS currency to be able to do that, it would not only need to exist of those countries, it would need a deficit market to invest it in, so potentially Europe. It's the one other very large deficit market other than the U.S. in the world, but I think the last year and a half, as a result of Russia's invasion, has pushed Europe very much back into the American camp. And when certain European leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron talk about flirting more with China, there tends to be a vociferal reaction against it. And then, finally, also just that, for China in particular, which would be the core of the system right now, it uses treasury bills as its core reserve instrument in its own banking system. So to actually change and to get away from the dollar in any kind of short-term horizon would have substantial risks for China as well. So people often talk about, okay, if we end up in an economic war with Beijing, as occurred with Russia, they can just dump their treasury holdings and, essentially the market won't be large enough to pick those up, and then there will be too much U.S. debt out there with not enough buyers, and this will break the U.S. economy. And I certainly believe that would break the U.S. economy, but it would also break the Chinese economy unless you had a BRICS currency established and built to replace it, as well as a debt market, and that would need to exist for years and years and years and move China away from trade with the United States. So, I'm a Russia watcher. I speak Russian. I spent a lot of time in the region. I particularly try to understand its economic agenda and its path in these. I don't claim to have that same kind of knowledge in China. I do see China as having a longer term strategy for this, but also one that evidences to me that they're wise enough not to think that a BRICS currency could be some kind of quick solution. You may see BRICS debt instruments kind of built up in sort of a BRICS equivalent to what are known as special drawing rights by the IMF, potentially through what's called the New Development Bank, which should be known as the BRICS Bank. But even there, we see real fundamental issues. The Wall Street Journal had a good report this last week on the challenges of the New Development Bank and the fact that it itself depends on dollars, right? And China, when it loans in its Belt and Road program, tends to loan in dollars. And then the fact that getting into some of those inter-alliance issues there, although Moscow is a capital contributing member of that bank, its loans in Russia have been suspended since the full-scale invasion last February as well, because that bank doesn't want to encounter the U.S. risk. So China and the U.S. may be diverging politically at an extremely rapid pace and probably have been since at least 2016, but those economic interdependencies exist there. And for China, I think it's far more the framework to look at it in terms of competition is one of mutually assured destruction and sort of the deterrent factor that has for both the U.S. and China in taking major international economic action, whereas in Russia's case it is, fighting a battle on the economic front that it can't win, just like it's fighting a battle that increasingly looks like it can't win in Ukraine as well. But in both cases, the continued cohesion, support, and resilience of the Western alliance, if that fails, then Russia's prospects on both fronts could potentially be a lot rosier.
So let's flip focus back to the United States. We focused on a lot of foreign entities here. I think the biggest controversy we've seen over the past couple of weeks would be, of course, the U.S. debt limit, which there was a ping pong match between Republicans and Democrats about if that was going to be raised. And then just recently after being raised, we've already hit the $32 trillion mark. So the U.S. debt limit and the U.S. debt crisis in itself has been a very controversial topic. How do you see that as a threat to the U.S. dollar, to U.S. supremacy? And how are we positioning ourselves by having this constant, like I was saying, a ping pong match in terms of how we actually want to handle the debt?
I mean, the most immediate threat from it, right, was that, failure to pass the debt ceiling limit, whether this time or the next time around in 2 years or in the various, 60 plus fights that have been had over the decades, would be that it would cause a short-term default, right? And then that may very well cause banks and financiers and trade credit suppliers around the world to no longer want to use the U.S. dollar as their instrument of account and reserve instrument, which would, as we discussed earlier, have real negative implications for the U.S.'s ability to enact its foreign policy, whether that be on sanctions or on economic relations with other countries. There is zero benefit, in my view, to a default, no matter how technical it is. I don't think that a short-term technical default that was cured within days would necessarily completely undermine the U.S. system, but it would certainly accelerate any calls for a move away from it, as well as create economic incentives for third countries and financial institutions outside the U.S. To move away from it. But secondly, I think it sort of really speaks to the deep misunderstanding we have of a lot of these issues in the United States, was that we tend to talk about the government's balance sheet and the government's debt as if it's a household, right? So I used the mortgage example earlier, and people often talk about, we can't live beyond our means and so on and so forth. And really, I think that's a gross misunderstanding of the role of U.S. debt in the world economy. If you think about it in terms of demand and supply of the U.S. debt, the supply goes up every time that we borrow more, or that the U.S. deficit grows. But really, the question is how large is the demand out there in the world for U.S. dollar assets? And in my view, that continues to grow pretty steadily. And globalization and global trade, because of the amount of financing that's done in U.S. dollars, as we discussed earlier, means that there's a pretty insatiable global appetite for U.S. treasuries. We have occasionally seen some technical issues with sort of short-term treasury borrowing that leave a lot of questions that I think are important for macroeconomists and international political economists to look at and to try to understand how much that is out there. But really, on sort of the overall level, I don't think that the issue is that there's too much debt out there in the world, and in U.S. debt, and in some cases it may be even that there's too little. And then you have to think about it. If the bank, there's the famous quote, right? If you owe the bank $1 million, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. That's kind of the case for the U.S. dollar in the world, right? We owe trillions out there around the world. But because of how central the U.S. dollar is, that's kind of less the U.S.'s problem and more the rest of the world's problem. And we gain this what's known as exorbitant privilege, and the ability to borrow and finance growth in times of difficulties. So, what we should have done probably in the aftermath of the global financial crisis was borrow more, not less, to engage in countercyclical policy and to have sped up the recovery from that. We saw that is the policy path that was chosen after COVID. We saw how much borrowing increased to fund a whole range of programs, and now is continuing with the desire to fund things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and so on and so forth. So, I think that, our ability to borrow is in many ways our superpower rather than a curse and a drain on the U.S. And it's not living beyond our means. It's, using the full benefit of our position in the international economy for U.S. taxpayers and U.S. voters, and if we can use that to borrow and engage in countercyclical policy to try to keep recession short and shallow, then it seems to me that it behooves us to do so rather than to engage in nonsense like these debt ceiling debates, which, of course, the debt ceiling debate, may have agreed a new short-term borrowing limit and the like, but these will all be blown through in future congressional defense and budget authorizations, and so it's not like any one of these debt ceiling debates ever has actually stopped the overall increase in U.S. borrowing.
If you guys enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more topic videos like this weekly, and make sure to check out some of my other topic videos, such as war with China and the economic collapse of the US, linked right here.